Hey guys, I'm Belias and today I would like to share with you the full Magic Fund version of the Scourge Arrow Pathfinder I've been playing in Sentinel League since pretty much day one. A quick disclaimer about this video, like this is not a full big guide, I will not show you every aspect of the build, so please don't copy what you see in this video one by one, it will not work. Like this is a very specific build which I tailored towards a specific strategy over the course of 2 to 3 weeks. A quick overview of the video. First of all, I will talk about the strategy that I'm using with this build. Then I will talk about the character itself, how it abuses the new Headhunter scaling with Scourge Arrow and Poison itself. Then I will talk about the juice that I've been using in these maps, why I've chosen the map, etc. With some stats from the over 900 maps with the strategy I've run in Sentinel League. And then we will have a look at a map showcase where I give some commentary. So you can decide for yourself if you want to play something similar to this build. So if you have a look on Power Ninja about this character, you will see that it basically has full quant gear with gold worms, Zardimas, double pariah, Greed's Embrace, and quantity amulet, as well as a rarity helmet with double rarity prefix suffix and the syndicate rarity mod, as well as the divination distillate, which we have 100% uptime due to petrified blood, with 70% increased class effect scaling from Pathfinder. If you have a quick look at the links that I'm using, first of all I'm using Scourge Arrow and Ballista Totem main link with item rarity support. In our main weapon we were using a double curse setup with a Mirage Archer's second Scourge Arrow effect to make use of life gain on hit effects. In our main helmet we are using a Divergent Rage setup with Frenzy, which basically with infinite action speed due to Headhunter gives us in a 50 rage, which gives us more movement speed. On that same topic we are using a Sinvicta's Edsmite axe in our weapon swap. Basically we tap it twice to get also access to rampage effects. In our glass we are using Vitality, we reserve it on our life to make use of the Watcher's Eye life gain on hit mod, which both keeps our character alive as well as the totems itself alive. In our boots we're using our main hour setup, Purity of Elements for blanket ailment immunity. We're using Petrified Blood to basically give us 100% uptime on our divination distillate, and we're using Grace mainly to use the Watcher's Eye modifier, which gives us increased movement speed. And then we have auxiliary in our rings, Blood Rage for frenzy generation and attack speed, and in the other ring Divergent Herald of Agony, which gives us poison chance cap as well as more damage with poisons. If we look in game, this is my level 100 Scourge Arrow Pathfinder I've been playing since pretty much day one, which uses Scourge Arrow. For those of you who've never used Scourge Arrow before, it's a channeled bow ability which basically channels up to 5 stages, and then once it reaches 5 stages you can release the skill to fire a main arrow, followed by 5 to 6 thorn pots, which also fire thorn arrows at the enemy. Why do you use the skill? First of all, it has a specific line which reads 150% more damage with hits and ailments per stage. So at 5 stages, basically we deal 750% more damage with hits and ailments. So this includes poisons. Also, each of these thorn pots can hit the same enemy, so if they overlap, an enemy can get hit by several of these thorn pots, so this skill can effectively shotgun an enemy with thorn arrows. If all the thorn arrows hit and the main arrow hits, it's basically like dealing 3 times the damage of the main arrow to a target. If you put it in the totem, however, it gets some interesting characteristics. Like if you put it in a totem and then the totem fires, it will always charge up to 5 stages, and then it will release, specifically at the server tick, it reaches 5 stages if there's an enemy it can shoot at. Why is that important? First of all, it basically fully utilizes the attack speed modifiers that your character has, specifically with Headhunter. If you have a lot of Soul Eater stacks, it will always utilize this insane attack speed perfectly. Like if I would use it handcasted, or if I attack myself, I would never be able to fully utilize the attack speed because I'm not fast enough. However, if I use 5 totems, they can basically always attack at the perfect timing, make full use of the insane attack speed scaling you get from Headhunter. So how does this build abuse the new Headhunter scaling to get insane amounts of damage scaling, even though you're pretty much using full garbage gear, full magic find gear with no stats on it whatsoever? If you think about your character in Path of Exile, or any character in Path of Exile for that matter, you have to think about it in terms of buckets. Like any ability in Path of Exile has several buckets that basically multiply off of each other to go from the skill that you're using to the damage that the enemy takes. These buckets are as follows. Like the first bucket is the APS, or the actions per second bucket, pretty much. How often do you attack per second? How many projectiles do you produce per second? How many instances of damage can you apply to an enemy in a given time frame? Then the next bucket is basically the flat damage. This is the base of the skill. All the other calculations are based upon. For example, with an attack skill, this primarily comes from your weapon, but there are other added damage sources. If you're using a spell gem, then it's mostly the flat damage that's added from your skill gem. Then there are increased damage modifiers, which all stack additively with each other, a lot of different increased sources, then multiply your flat sources once. Then there are other multipliers from your more multiplier sources, which primarily come from your skill gem, from your support gems supporting your skill gem, but there are a lot of other more multipliers. Each more multiplier instance or several more multiplier instances multiply each other multiplicatively and then get applied to your flat and your increased damage. However, it's not only important how much damage you deal, but it's also important how much damage the enemy takes. For that matter, another important bucket is the enemy's resistance towards the damage type you're dealing. If you shred a lot of enemies' resistances to the damage you're dealing, you will in fact deal a lot of more effective damage to that enemy. Also, there are other modifiers which can influence how much damage the enemy is taking from a certain type of damage. For example, the most common one found is shock. If you deal 50% shock to an enemy, they take 50% increased damage from all sources. So if we have a look at the new Headhunter buffs, like the new Arch Nemesis modifiers, which were introduced in 3.18 Sentinel League, and you take the list of the over 80 modifiers and you apply them to your character, like if you're in a reduced content scenario with the 60-second Headhunter buffs, you're pretty much guaranteed to have all the buffs active on your character at all times. And you basically list all of these modifiers, you will see that most of these buffs fall into 3 of these buckets. Like first of all, the APS bucket. With Soul Eater, you get an insane amount of increased attack speed or increased cast speed scaling, which then gets further multiplied by Equist, which basically gives all your skills repeat 2 additional times. So you get an insane amount of action per second, so that many builds basically hit the actions per second cap of 30. So you can't physically attack faster than that in Path of Exile. The next bucket is the flat bucket, specifically for physical attack scaling builds, but also for physical spell builds. There are a lot of modifiers like Flame Strider, Frost Strider, etc., which give you a lot of physical damage as extra damage from a certain type. Physical damage as damage from a random element, physical damage as fire damage, physical damage as chaos damage. Why is that important for our poison build? Because there's also a modifier which comes from 2 Arch Nemesis modifier, which are relatively common, from the Entangler and the Toxic modifier, which reads, all damage from hits can poison, or all damage from hits you inflict can poison. Why is that important? Because that's basically a blanket Shaper of Flames-like effect from the Elementalist, but for poisons. So each of these physical damage as sources gets also applied to our poison build, but more from that later. Then there are also insane amounts of generic increased damage sources, but also a lot of increased damage of certain types, increased elemental damage, increased physical damage, increased chaos damage, etc., which also can all apply to the poison build because of the Toxic and Entangler mods. However, the other buckets, like the more damage taken buckets, the enemy's resistance bucket and enemy's increased damage taken bucket, basically not a lot of Headhunter buffs apply to these buckets. Like more multipliers, there are not a lot of generic more multipliers from Headhunter. Like I don't think there are any. There are no modifiers which shred enemy's resistance or affect enemy resistance in any meaningful way, which is the main reason why Headhunter builds are so effective with Omniscience build, because that's the ones that the Headhunter doesn't give you. Also, there are not a lot of enemies increased damage taken sources, like the 2 that come to my mind are mainly the generic nearby enemies take 30% increased damage modifier that one of the Arch Nemesis modifiers gives, but also some blanket shock scaling even for non-lightning damaging builds from Stormweaver and Stormstrider, which basically means all your damage you deal with hits can shock. So even if you deal no lightning damage at all, if you have very small hits, doesn't matter, you still get a very minor amount of shock scaling on any build. So if you want to abuse the new Headhunter scaling on your build, you pretty much want to focus, due to diminishing returns, you want to focus on the buckets that Headhunter doesn't provide to your character. So you want as many more damage multipliers as possible, you want as many enemy resistance shredding effects as possible, and you want as many enemies increased damage taken sources as possible. How does our Scourge Arrow Pathfinder achieve this? Like, this is our Scourge Arrow Pathfinder. Path of building in the description as always. Which currently deals about 600,000 main arrow DPS, which doesn't sound like a lot. Like, if you multiply this by your 5 ballista totems and take the thorn arrows into consideration, that's about 3 to 5 million poison DPS with the current setup without any headhunter bows, which obviously doesn't sound like a lot. If you could look at how this build gets this damage applied, however, you will see that we have a lot of investment in more damage multiplier sources, first of all. Like, we get an insane amount, almost 7,000% more damage, which primarily comes from this line. Deal 150% more damage per stage for hits and ailments, which multiplies off of all other modifiers. Another important modifier is this line from Darkstone, which basically reads you have a 20% chance for poisons with this weapon to deal 300% more damage, which mathematically basically means 60% more poison damage. But it also feeds into another ability we abuse, which I will talk about later, about the poison proliferation aspect of Pathfinder, which is the main reason why we're using Pathfinder. Then there's also, since we are a poison build, we get another more multiplier source, which is multiplicative with all other more multipliers, which is a conglomeration between damage over time multiplier, chaos damage over time multiplier, as well as the rate that or poison deals damage, as well as the effective length of the poison. So we get another more multiplier scaling option from just being a poison build, which multiplies of the already insane more multiplier source. Then for the next bucket, the enemies resist bucket, in our build we are scaling a lot of increased despair curse effects, so much so that we get very potent despair on our enemies. Despair is a curse which does a lot of things, but primarily it gives you added chaos damage with attacks against the enemies, it gives the enemies reduced chaos resistances, and it gives the enemies increased damage taken from damage over time effects. So if you have a very strong despair curse effect, you improve both the base of your skill, but you also shred a lot of chaos resistances, which is very hard to come by for the damage over time build. The third line, enemies affected take increased damage. We scale that by 300%, so the enemies takes a lot of increased damage from chaos from damage over time effects. There's another line from increased damage on the enemies and increased damage taken. Our Glorious Vanity gives us an ability which called Switcher of Shadow, which basically gives all of our hits 25% chance to inflict Withered on hit. We have 5 totems, we attack ourselves, we have a lot of APS, so if there is an enemy which lives a little bit longer than your average white pack, if you are very far in the Delirium Mirror and the enemies get a little bit tankier, you also get this Wither scaling, so you can relatively consistently apply 15 Wither sticks, which then also applies a 120% increased chaos damage taken on the enemy as well. So if we have a look back at our buckets, we have insane more damage scaling from Scourge Arrow, from our gear choices, as well as from our chaos damage choices, or chaos damage over time scaling choices. On the enemy resistance side, we have a very potent despair curse effect, which shreds a lot of chaos resistance from the enemies. And on the increased enemy taken side, we also have a very potent increased damage taken from damage over time effects from the despair, as well as from the wither itself. So if you take our character, which specializes in these 3 buckets, and you multiply it with juiced content with all the insane headhunter scaling, you get absolutely ridiculous amounts of basically damage scaling for free. So no matter what gear you're using with your character, as long as you're using these more multipliers, which multiply off the flat and APS multiplier sources from the headhunter, you deal absurd amounts of damage, even though you're using full trash quantity magic find build. So you have this character which now deals a lot of damage. However, if you go into a map, there's more to Path of Exile than just to deal a lot of damage. Like if you go in the map and you deal an infinite amount of damage to the first monster and it dies, and then you get to the next monster, deal infinite amounts of damage to it, the map will take absolutely forever. So there are obviously more dimensions to a character than just dealing infinite damage, even though Path of Ninja Warriors would like you to differentiate in that aspect. First additional bucket that I would like to introduce is the movement speed bucket. Obviously, if you destroy a pack and then go to the next pack, the only really important modifier that applies this ability to move between packs and to move across the map is movement speed. So our build also has 270% increased movement speed, which doesn't sound like a lot, but basically due to the quantity gear, our boots only have 10% increased movement speed and our chest gives us 20% reduced movement speed, and we don't have access to any tailwind scaling. We basically still have a lot of movement speed for a character like this, like 270% increased movement speed with Pathfinder flasks, pretty much the whole map. However, there are also two other buckets which I would like to introduce, which is for one the area of effect or damage actualization bucket, as I like to call it. What do I mean by damage actualization? It's basically how does your character apply the damage that you deal to your environment and to the enemy that's in that environment. For example, if you have infinite area of effect, one hits, you press the button once and the entire screen explodes. Other important actualization modifiers are, for example, explosions. This propagate your damage across the whole screen, or other proliferation effects. On that matter, Pathfinder has a very unique characteristic of poison proliferation. Poison proliferation from Pathfinder basically reads, if a poisoned enemy dies, it applies its poison to nearby enemies during any flask effect. So if an enemy dies, it applies its strongest poison to nearby enemies. Why is that important? And if you clear a pack and there's a tanky rare in the middle of that pack, you kill the white monsters, which basically die instantly no matter what build you're playing, and they all apply their strongest poison to the remaining enemies, so that rare also dies basically instantly. But if you're in a juiced map scenario where you have a lot of density, this damage basically scales with density. The denser pack the map is, the more overlapping proliferation effect do you have. Why is that important? Because you kill a pack, it dies, it spawns beyond portals. The beyond portals spawn monsters. These monsters are in your already proliferating damage areas. The unique beyond demon spawns, it's already in the active damage area and it basically instantly dies. Like in the footage you will oftentimes see, there are some health bars, especially in the others, the health bars disappear, then the beyond spawns and the beyond just snaps out of existence. Which is really important because you will want to kill the unique enemies as fast as possible, obviously, so they are not active while you're looting, or they don't kill you while you're looting. Another bucket which is very important, like Path of Exile is a game about killing as many monsters in as short of a time as possible. So if you have a perfect character which moves insanely fast, deals insane damage, basically one-taps the screen, if you compare two characters, the only real important modifier if they do the same content is the item quantity modifier. Why? Because if you both do the same content, slay the same amount of monsters in the same amount of time, the person with the 100% increased item quantity modifier will drop nearly double twice the amount of loot that the character which basically uses no con. So if you scale everything else in Path of Exile, the only important stat that matters is the item quantity modifier, because it basically is another bucket which scales everything else in the video game. So now we do have our insanely fast, insanely damage dealing Pathfinder with 105% increased item quantity and a lot of item rarity support. What do we do with this character? We're running a lot of juiced tropical island maps with Beyond on them. Why Tropical Island compared to a map like Crimson Temple? In Tropical Islands there's this divination card called the Scout. Scout is an 8 divination card set which gives you 7 exalted orbs. And this card is very common. Like, it's this card that scales insanely well without a lot of RNG involved with the juice that you put into your maps. You put more juice into your maps, you put more quantity into your maps, you get more scout returns. There are no dry streaks of 500 maps of not getting an apothecary drop, for example. And also this card drops very frequently, very commonly, so there's no real use of using expensive divination scalps. Like, I don't know why people even use these scalps, like 5 gilded divination scalps for 1 exalted orbs, then you drop an additional apothecary in 200 maps and all the profits are eaten by the ridiculous amount of divination scalps you put to the map and they don't even add any juice. I much rather put more juice on my maps, drop more generic stuff. Divination cards, no matter what strategy you're using, is always a very slim amount of the profit margin of the maps. They're basically just there for your dopamine kicks. Okay, so we run those tropical islands because they're basically the poster child of a good map for a delirium mirror effect. So we put Beyond on the map. We use the Beyond sextant to spawn more unique Beyond demons, more corrupted 6-link items, but also more identified rare items. Why is it important? This league, amulets with +1 to all skill jumps are very important, very expensive, because you can recombine them. Also weapons with expensive modifiers. The more items are identified, so you can get a lot of items which are identified, you can fill them with your loot filter. This also applies to corrupted items. Also, you could drop sentinels which drop corrupted, but that only means they are basically identified, so you get perfectly usable sentinels which are already identified, which is huge quality of life as well. You use this Beyond on the map, then you put a delirium mirror on there. Why a delirium mirror and not just put orbs? A delirium mirror, first of all, you don't use any stupid delirium orbs, you don't have to buy them, but you are generating them, so you're also generating currency with your delirium mirror, and you know how expensive those can get. Also, you get a full simulacrum at the end. Like, it's very consistent to get 300 splinters on a tropical island map. It's the poster child for delirium mirror, especially with the Descent into Madness, previously known as Greater Forces delirium node. Then the third sextant, which is very important for this strategy, is the unique monsters to corrupted item sextant, which basically means all these packs of enemies that we slayed, which spawn all these unique Beyond demons, drop corrupted items, which then use corrupt into 6 links, which we can render for divine orbs, and which also identify in these aforementioned recombiner materials. For the fourth sextant, I like to use the Alva sextants mainly because I run so many maps, so I can sustain my Alvas. But if you have some Alva missions lagging on the side, you can juice your maps even further. I really like to use the elevated versions of the Abyss and the Breach sextant. Why? Because you already juice Breach and Abyss a lot, so adding more of these to your map always give you great returns. Speaking of sextants, scarabs, we're using a Gilded Abyss and Gilded Breach scarab to juice up our maps. Then we also use Rusted, Polished or Gilded, doesn't matter which Elder Scarab, to put Elder Influence for maps. Why do we do that? Because Elder Influence basically puts these Elder portals to your maps, which are unique enemies themselves, but they also spawn a lot of enemies, and these enemies can spawn further beyond. And the most important scarab, like this is the most overpowered scarab for any type of Beyond juicing, any type of unique corrupted strategy, or any type of divine strategy, is the Blighted Scarab, because Blights in maps, especially with the immune response and the mycelial swarm passives, they spawn an absolutely ridiculous amount of monsters, they spawn an absolutely ridiculous amount of Beyond demons, which also drop a lot of shit, a lot of uniques, which corrupt into unique signals, which you can render for divine orbs. Like, sometimes it feels like half of the map's loot just comes from the silly blight encounter, especially if it's towards the end of your maps. Speaking of Atlas passive skill tree, like, it's a very generic Atlas passive skill tree, which we use for these delirium mirrors. We use the entire top hat of the tree, which basically gives us all these modifiers of non-unique maps. So we scale the base quant and the base pack size of our maps as much as possible. We also use Fortune favors the breadth on our maps to get 10 quantity and pack size on each of our maps. And then we juice all of the abilities that we want on our maps to juice the delirium, but also to juice our pack size. First of all, we take all the Alva nodes on the tree to get very juicy Alvas and to build very good temples on the side. We take both of mycelial swarm and immune response to get very juicy blights. We take all the Beyond wheels on the tree. We take Descent into Madness for faster progressing delirium distance, so the delirium progresses faster with distance to the mirror, which basically means you scale to full delirium faster, which makes the delirium harder, but also gets you to the max quant multiplier faster and gives you basically guaranteed 300 stacks as long as the things on your maps don't spawn too far at the start of your map. Next up, we juice breaches and abysses as much as possible. So Flash Breach, and as well as all the extra monster abyss nodes on the tree. Abysses spawn an absolute a lot of monsters on your maps, as well as breaches, together with the Gilded Breach and Abyss Scarabs. Influence wise, we obviously use Eater of Worlds influence with the node Shadows of Honor, which basically gives you more shrines on the map. Shrines are absolutely busted with this strategy, especially the quantity and rarity shrine. We have already very juicy maps. we have a character with a lot of item quantity and rarity, and then if you stack these shrine effects on top of that, it gets really ridiculous. Like if you get 3 or 4 of these shrines in your maps, it feels like the map all of a sudden starts dropping 4 or 5 times the loot of a normal map. But the other altars are also really good, like the basic currency duplication, the divination duplication, and the unique duplication ones are really good, as well as the scarab ones, but they're not as important since we're running not a lot of maps per hour, so the scarab one's not as important for our strategy. Blocking wise, we block a lot of abilities which we already force on the map, or which we could roll with Fortune Favors the Brave. Why do we do that? To basically increase the base chance of other abilities which we want to choose a delirium mirror on our maps. So we get more abysses and breaches, but also more rituals, to get more juice on average on all of the other maps. Some quick stats about these maps. I've so far in this league I've won over 900 of these maps. There are huge profit margins. I don't want to bore you with a stupid convoluted X per hour margins, so I will show you some more stats. I drop about 13 to 14 divines per map, very consistently. So basically you drop almost an exalted orb worth of divines per map, then you obviously get your full simulacrum per map. Sometimes you get a little bit less than 300 stacks, but they're super cheap, so it doesn't matter a lot. Then scouts wise, I drop about 1 scout in 4 maps, so on average 28 scouts per 69 maps. I drop between 20 and 30 war exalted orbs in my maps per 96 maps. From the magic finding side so far, in these over 900 maps, I've dropped 47 Aegis Aurora shields, I've dropped 11 inspired learnings, I've dropped over 4 I've dropped 4 unnatural instincts, I've dropped a corrupted headhunter. So far, sadly, no luck with the mage blood, but I'm keep coping to drop one day, and I will keep this strategy going. First of all, because it's extremely lucrative, but also because I want to have a mage blood drop. I've never had a natural mage blood drop, I always have to buy mine. So now I will show you a full run-through with some commentary about the map, and then I will put some closing thoughts. Thank you so far for watching this video. It means a lot to me to share this with you. Go away. Welcome to the gameplay section of this video, where I will basically lead you through a full run of the map and answer some maybe less obvious things about the build. Like, first of all, we put Fortune Favors the Brave on the build with the juice that's stated in the juice section. Before I go into the map, I belt swap Headhunter and Mage Blood repeatedly to get my health below 50%, so I'm basically prepped for the Divination Distillate uptime. The build is not 100% res capped without flasks, like the main resistance comes from the flasks, so it's important to have uptime on those while you're basically ramping. At the beginning, the character is extremely weak, so you need to get 20-30 Headhunter buffs rolling before the build comes online. So at the beginning of the map, basically the first thing you want to do is proc the influence. The first influence spawns a lot of monsters, which spawn a lot of beyond monsters. So basically, yeah, as you see here, after the influence spawn, I'm at 20 stacks. I'm basically safe for the rest of the map. Like defensive wise, this build, if you look at the path of building on paper, it looks like it is an absolute glass cannon. If something breathes on it, it looks like it would die, and then we are using petrified blood to keep our HP most of the map below 50%, but we don't die. So how do we survive in this extremely juicy content with all these map modifiers? Like, I don't roll over specific map modifiers that are hard, like minus max, because I want to keep the beyond on the maps. So basically, at the current state of Headhunter, it's absolutely busted defense-wise. If you look at all the modifiers, first of all, you get resistance cap with Headhunter, 400% over in every type of resistance. Then you get max resistance, which is absolutely... Why do they give us max resistance? So you're at 58% max resistance. You take very little damage from all elemental and chaos damage sources. Then you get some flat spell block, and almost every of the buffs, especially the rare ones, gives you additional physical damage reduction. So much so that if you have 40 stacks, you're basically physical damage reduction capped without determination. If you're a juicer Headhunter build, determination does absolutely nothing for you. So the few defensive layers that the build has are not as important because Headhunter gives everything that you need. Another important stat which Headhunter gives you now is 100% spell suppression, so you don't need to build spell suppression whatsoever on your gear. Like you've seen, my gear basically has no defensive stats, no resistance stats, and it's not just 100% like your standard 100% overpowered spell suppression you use on normal builds. No, it's even better than that because I don't know the specific percentage, but it basically mitigates more than your average amount of spell suppression. You will see the HP globe, sometimes it dips below the 1.6 or 2k HP mark. So that means you actually took damage through all these defensive layers that are provided by Headhunter. So how do we recover? How do we recover our life so insanely fast? We're using Vitality reserved on our life. Like you see the small amount of life reserved. That's the Vitality together with the life on hit. Vitality watchers are. So we basically, from the Mirage Archer setup, we generate hundreds of HP per second just from hitting enemies with this Mirage Archer curse setup. But this also works for the totems. So you put down the totems and you see the totems, if they get hit, they hit something and they're for life. This is very important, so we don't have to invest into any nodes on the tree which make our totems more durable. They basically can keep themselves alive, which is important because sometimes you don't know where your totems are. They have to basically live for themselves. Speaking of which, sometimes you see, especially if you pop a breach like in this situation, together with something else like Cassia or an Abyss, it can get sometimes a bit laggy, especially if you pop your Sentinel on top of that. But that's 100% completely fine with this build because you put down your totems, and the totems shoot even if you lag. Like the totems keep you safe even if you lag. Sometimes it can be a bit iffy if you are trying to defend the Cassia, if you're teleporting all over the place with Shroudwalker. If you are interested in a less Magic Find centric version of this build, like if you do this build with less scuffed Magic Find gear, you can expect you to be able to get this build going for around 40x together with your Headhunter. Like I've done this at the beginning when Headhunter was buffed, and even before that, with a very similar character with very cheap gear. Like Poison Bow is a very cheap build at the moment because basically nobody plays it. I don't know why exactly. It has some bad stigmatas to it, especially in the Ballista setup. Like it's always, they always say it's delayed because you put down the totem, and then it's delayed because of the poison. But if you look at the footage, you see that's just the case in non-gist content. Like in gist content, everything dies instantly, basically. So you can snatch super cheap jewels for the build. You can snatch super cheap gear for the build. Like I like to use snake bites and a Dendro bait while pushing 100 early with some onslaught scaling. Just to get movement speed and basic survivability. Like early on in the league, I like to run Ghost Shrouds with a very basic evasion energy shield setup with this build, and I can push this build to 100 in basically 127 hours, which is around 90 hours played, just with Ghost Shrouds, evasion, and ailment immunity. So if you are interested in playing a less scuffed Scourge Arrow Pathfinder build, I implore you to look at my maybe week 1 POB of this league. I have some other videos up with my Scourge Arrow versions from last few leagues. Like I played this basically every league since I think Ultimatum League, because it's so easy to league start and because it's so easy to race on. Like Poison Bow is probably the tankiest and most fun and fastest build to get going off the ground, in my opinion. I haven't played a lot of other bow builds, but this is the one that I gravitate towards just because it's so easy to build. And basically you step on a Danube, you step on a Darkscorn, and it gets you to 16 maps in a few hours. So please look at other characters on my profile. I play a lot of Pathfinders. I think last league it was called Raider Loves PoE. For a less scuffed version, which was also like I built them all for just content. In Scourge League I played a very similar build with a lot of defensive layers, which could do Wave 30 simulacrums and bosses very well as well. So this build isn't locked into doing just content. You can tailor it to whatever the build needs you to do. Like basically I do everything on this build because I'm lazy and I play one build per league. While in others, basically you don't want to waste too much time to keep your Rampage going. The Rampage comes from this Invictus weapon swap, so I have this Invictus Edsmile X in my weapon swap, which gives me Onslaught. Due to poison kills counting as yourself, it's not addressed as a totem, but basically every enemy that dies is addressed as one of your kills. This is important for on-kill effects, like we get life on kill back for each kill, so each enemy that dies regenerates 2% of life per kill. If you kill 100 enemies per second, that's 200% life per second regenerated. But this also basically gives you, if an enemy dies while you have your Edsmite X equipped, you basically trigger the Rampage and then you can keep it going basically through the whole map. I know it's a bit annoying to use your weapon swap like that, but I really like it. Like basically you press your weapon swap key twice at the start of the map and then you forget about it. The rage that you see that I currently have comes from the Divergent Rage with the Frenzy setup. Basically, if you have a lot of attacks per second from the Soul Eater, you just and wait for another league mechanic for the Abyss to spawn. For your breach to fully open, you can just stand there and spam it. It has a 20% chance to give you one rage, and you attack 30 times per second, so you attack a bit on the spot, and you have full rage, which gives you 25% movement speed. Like towards the end of the map, like if you're at 8.5 to 9 stacks, things can get a bit tankier, especially if you take a lot of altar mods. Like in this Alva, it gets a bit tankier, but you see the poison proliferation, basically the blue Alva, which is tanky, dies, and the Beyond spawns and Beyond dies as well. But while clearing these maps, basically the Delirium has a certain pace, so you don't want to outrun it, and you have a lot of time anyways if you're doing something else. Step on all those melons you see on the ground, they spawn small packs of Delirium demons. They give splinters, they give other loot, so if you currently don't know what you're doing or you have to wait for the Delirium, step on the melons. It's a very easy way to get 300 stacks and more loot in general. With Descending to Madness at the end of the maps, as I said, it can get a bit tanky, but with the new Headhunter scaling, even though you have basically no offensive scaling on your gear outside of Dot Multi and the Darkscorn, like you're at the end of the map usually. Here's where the boss takes a little while, but you just step on the melons, the Delirium mob spawn, and the map is dead. In an ideal world, after you end the Delirium Fog, you will have way less than 50 monsters remaining. That means you can basically loot without any problems. Like here we got 300 stacks, 30 monsters remaining. That's a little bit high, so I go a little bit back and see if I can clear some more of the monsters remaining. Why is that important? Because once the Headhunter stacks fall off, you're basically not resist capped anymore. Without the Mage Blood belt swap. So it makes your life a little bit easier if you go a little bit back and clear a little bit more. So if you look at what dropped, a lot of 6-link on the ground. So at this stage the map is done. Took a lot. It takes between 6 and 9 minutes to do the map. And then you loot the map. So you put on your Like, you don't have to use the Mage Blood, it makes it more comfortable. The Mage Blood gives me a res cap even without Headhunter stacks. So you can loot them up very comfortably. Like, I have a 6 whites Invictus, so I can level Empowers and Enlightens in the build. You drop a lot of Enlightens and Empowers with all the quantity. But I don't want to bore you with the looting. Like, the map takes 6 minutes, 6 to 9 minutes. The looting takes about 3 minutes. You run about 5 maps per hour. If you prep away 69 maps, that takes about 30 hours to run in total, which takes 2 to 3 days of game time, and then you sell everything. You made about 3 to 5 times what you put into the maps, and then you buy the next rotation. Like, usually the juice prep takes 2 to 3 hours, and then you are ready to go for 3 days. So, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions about the build, feel free to ask me here on YouTube or on my Discord. Like, my Discord is in the description. Any questions about Scourge Arrow Pathfinder in general, or if you're interested in Scourge Arrow Pathfinder builds, I'm always happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much for watching this video. Feedback is always appreciated. And stick around. I think I will do a few more videos in the future. Like, not on a regular basis, but we'll see. Thank you very much.